Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank you for joining us today at the Aga Khan Museum for this afternoon devoted to the arts and culture of Aleppo. My name is Henry Kim, and I'm the Director and CEO of the Aga Khan Museum. I'm very pleased to share today with you, as I don't believe there's been a topic more in our minds than Syria. The war that ravages in the country is now in its 6th year. Images of refugees fleeing their homes weigh heavily on our hearts. And for those of us who study the arts and culture of Syria, there have been moments that will forever be carved in our minds, including the destruction of the iconic minaret of the Great Mosque of Aleppo in 2013, the murder of the Syrian archaeologist Professor Khalid al-Assad in Palmyra, and the destruction of the Temple of Baal Shamin in 2015. As a museum and arts organization, what role can we play? I personally believe that the work that museums do should and must be relevant to the issues of today. They should reflect our times and resonate with the questions that are at the top of our minds. Museums and art institutions can be responsive. They can be brave. In response to the crisis in Syria, this museum has created a series of programs devoted to exploring the arts and culture of Syria. The centerpiece of our program is the exhibition, Syria, A Living History, which has been curated by our curator, Phyllis Shakir Philip, and also Professor Nasser Rabat, the Aga Khan Professor of Islamic Architecture at MIT. The main architectural advisor for this exhibition is Dr. Ross Burns, who is here to speak to us today. The exhibition brings together exceptional artworks that tell a story of the country, a story of cultural diversity, historical continuity, resourcefulness, and of course, resilience. I hope that after today's lecture and performance that all of you will take up our invitation to see this exhibition. The Syria season also includes lectures, films, and performances, including this afternoon's program devoted to Aleppo. And before I make any introductions today, I'd really like to thank all of our sponsors who've helped support this initiative and all of its programs. These include our program patron, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, our program partner, the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, our media sponsors, the Globe and Mail and also CTV, and of course our supporters, the patrons of the Aga Khan Museum, Mohammed and Naja Al-Zaibak and the Bay Tree Foundation, and our community partners, the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, and also Lifeline Syria. Today's programs bring together in one event the many aspects of our museum's public offerings. It includes an uplifting performance, an enlightening talk, a thought-provoking exhibition, and is followed by the chance to continue our dialogue over coffee immediately afterwards. I hope that you enjoy all parts of this program. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Nye Syrian Children's Choir. The Children's Choir is a Toronto-based charity established in April of this year that provides recently arrived Syrian refugee children aged 6 to 12 with a unique opportunity to learn to express their yearning, love, and hope through singing and song. The children receive free weekly music education and sing in their mother tongue, as well as the languages of this new country. The choir was established by the settlement organization Culturalink in 2016 under the directorship of Ibrahim Absi, and since then has performed in some of Toronto's main cultural events, including the Luminato Festival and the 6 Degree Symposium. Today, we're proud that they'll perform at the Aga Khan Museum. So without further ado, here's the Nye Syrian Children's Choir.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Taharevich Dani. I'm one of the conductors with the children's choir. And I just wanted to introduce our lovely musicians on stage, Monique, Rahaf, Ismail, Adham, and our lovely administrators, Nadine and Faye, who have all done an amazing job in bringing these kids together for today. And I also wanted to acknowledge our partnership with the Regent Park School of Music that has brought in musical collaboration with 3 new music educators, including myself, to work with the kids this year. The 3 pieces that they will be performing for you is Halalaleya, Lama Bada Yatan and Singing for Peace, the song that they're most well known for this past year.
يشرح هواه الصاري عم كاسر المايه ودرب حلب درب حلب ودرب الشام مشيت وكله شجر زيتون يا يابا ولك حاج تبكي تبكي وتنوح رح نجي بكرة رح نجي ولك رح نجي ونعود يا
That was tremendous. I think all of you probably felt the same sort of, I don't know, it was emotional just hearing that song. I think that in many ways you look at the response of Canada to the Syrian refugee crisis, and it's been amazing actually what's happened over the course of the last year. Let me just get a show of hands. How many of you in the audience are actually involved in rehousing Syrian families? I think that there's probably a very large number. That's tremendous, because I have to say that one of the real hallmarks of the effort of Canada in the resettlement of Syrian refugees has been how much it's been down to the efforts of individuals. Families bringing in families into their own houses and helping with the integration process of Syrians into this new country. I think the song that you just heard here is a remarkable example of that, where it is quite something to hear children who probably had not spoken English in their lives until they came to Canada now singing fluently, as they just did a few moments ago. It's absolutely tremendous. And I think that when you look at it, look at the situation, it's happening at all levels, whether it is individuals or government. I was very pleased that we had the Minister of Immigration and Citizenship, John McCallum, open the exhibition about 3 weeks ago. I've also had word today from the Ontario Minister for Citizenship and Immigration, Laura Albanese. She wanted to wish this entire audience her very best wishes, because again, when it comes to this Syrian crisis, I think that when you look at what people have done, they've truly stepped up to the plate and they've really made this happen. It's tremendous seeing the integration and what's happening today. Now, I'd like to turn our attention now to the keynote address of this afternoon, which is going to be given by Dr. Ross Burns, or should I say Ambassador Ross Burns. Dr. Burns is a world-renowned expert on the monuments and architecture of Syria. He is the author of 3 books on the archaeology and history of Syria, including the recently published and released history of the city of Aleppo called Aleppo, a History. It was released, I believe, in September of this year, just a few weeks ago. After graduating from Sydney University, Dr. Burns spent 37 years in the Australian Foreign Service, with appointments that are impressive not only for their number and duration, but also for their timings during critical periods in the histories of their regions. These include his appointment and his term as ambassador to Syria and Lebanon from 1984 to 1987, as head of the Middle East and Africa branch in Canberra from 1988 to 1991, as ambassador to South Africa during the transition from apartheid to democracy, 1992 to 1995, as minister in Paris, ambassador to UNESCO, and ambassador to Greece from 1998 to 2001, and finally as ambassador in Tel Aviv from 2001 to 2003. Since retiring from the diplomatic life in 2003, Dr. Burns furthered his education by completing a doctorate at Macquarie University in Sydney on the archaeology of Roman cities of the Eastern Empire. Over the course of his travels and in-depth study of the region, he's amassed an impressive photo archive recording the magnificent and diverse architecture and landscape of Syria. You can see some of his photography as part of the Syria exhibition, and I'm certain that you'll see a number of these illustrations during today's lecture. I think that when you look at his efforts to document monuments, topography, and the built environment, his archive, which I believe is it monumentsofsyria.org or .com? It's one of those two. It's on the slide coming up. That is one of the great resources which, when you encounter periods of conflict, actually become very important records of the past. It's a tremendous archive. I believe it numbers some 100,000 images, and I have to say that it is a tremendous achievement, which of course dates back to his time in the 1980s, straight up to the present moment. Dr. Burns is here as part of a lecture tour organized by the Aga Khan Museum. After today's talk, he travels to Houston, where he will give a talk on Tuesday at the Asia Society. and then on to Vancouver on Thursday, where he'll give a talk at the Ismaili Center in Burnaby. Now, I should mention that I first met Ross only about a year ago at a conference on culture and conflict at St. John's College, Oxford. At that time, I mentioned to him that I had a crazy idea to create an exhibition in under a year about the art and culture of Syria. Ross very willingly obliged and became part of our team. And he served as our architectural and landscape historian for this exhibition. And I can say without hesitation that the exhibition could not have happened without his efforts. I just have to mention as well, this curatorial team, the team of experts who put this exhibition together, were actually located on 3 separate continents, which meant that 5 p.m. Toronto time was just about right to catch Nasser Rabat in in Bonn or in Paris at around 11 p.m. his time, and of course to catch Ross the next morning waking up in Sydney. So it shows you that international collaboration can truly take place, and I have to say that this trio of experts, Filiz, Ross, and Nasser, really did create something that is truly magnificent. So again, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Ross Burns. Try it out and then I'll remove it.
Okay, all right. I think it's okay.
Okay.
Well, what we're going to cover today is a very grim travelogue of central Aleppo. But before we get into that, I'd just like to express my great thanks for this invitation to speak today at this event. I think there have been many events which try to bring alive people's memories or experiences of Syria, but I think this one is really exceptional, and I feel greatly privileged to have been invited to speak at it. I think the theme was very well established by the children's choir, because above all, what we want to do is not forget Syria, not forget the great traditions which it represents. But I think too many of these gestures have been in-house conferences which just speak to a small coterie of experts and academics without getting across the message to the wider world. So I think this series of events here at the Aga Khan Museum is something quite extraordinary, and I'm very privileged to be part of the experience. And it was particularly good to have been asked to follow the young Syrian children's choir, because I think they are very much part of the future of Syria, which we all want to see preserved. So Syria is, in my view, one of the world's great outdoor museums. It's richer in its variety and the coverage of its remains than any other nation. This is a pretty wild statement, of course. And many of you might put your hand up and say, well, what about classical or Renaissance Italy or pharaonic Egypt? But of course, what I'm talking about is that Syria represents a range of remains of the past which is unequaled by any other civilization, I think. It's, of course, part of the heritage or the jigsaw of world cultures. But without Syria, you don't really understand what happened in the Roman, Byzantine, early Islamic, medieval Islamic, or Ottoman civilizations. And it's all available, or was available before 2011, to the visitor in a most spectacular fashion. What I want to do today is to give you a dispassionate and accurate account of what Aleppo has to offer. Then to continue to talk about what I think has been lost. But above all, I want to leave you with a message. Don't write off Syria. I haven't had a practice on this little gizmo yet, so I hope I don't make too many missteps. So this is a rough summary of the scope of the talk today. And we'll move on to the first section. And this, of course, is not Aleppo, but it is Warsaw at the end of World War II. And I bring it here to your attention because I think we have to go back to World War II to find a conflict which has so physically devastated a country. But we also need to remember that Europe's loss of life at the end of World War II, some 55 million people, was spread over a much larger area and a bigger population base. Aleppo, however, may have suffered more concentrated devastation in terms of physical damage and population displacement. And this was well put by Mamoun Abdul Karim when he talked in this forum a month ago. Quote, "If the war continues, we will lose Aleppo," he said, "and it will become like Warsaw in 1944. Looks like I haven't quite mastered the technique. There we are. No, I just want to put some raw figures up there for you because I think we have to look at what's happening to Aleppo in the context of the whole conflict which has raged for the last 5 years. The consequences of Syria's meltdown have already been felt in a wide region from Iraq to Scandinavia. The effects in the immediate region are likely to be more profound than anything suffered since the Nakba of 1948, whose secondary explosions, of course, have run on for decades. What I want to do today was to concentrate on the monumental walled city of Aleppo, which is that little red square in the middle of the picture of the map. But I want to emphasize that damage to the city's overall housing stock is overwhelmingly greater than what we see in the monumental area. Aleppo has scraped through many phases of great disruption and devastation. Its citizens learnt to live with each other again, despite the devastating challenges over thousands of years of Persian, Mongol and Timurid invasions, nomadic incursions or rioting Turkish military. Aleppo became a refuge for many minorities from the wider region, which we're looking at in this map, from Armenia to Iraq. As a city, it was more committed to tolerance, more interested in getting on with life and making money, and ready to set aside the broader tensions of the region. Thus, it survived over the millennia. And yet, in 2012, that spirit of coexistence collapsed. What I want to look at today is why. And one thing I would point out to you is that it's very difficult to isolate Aleppo from the forces of the region around it. You see here on this map, oh dear, right. You see here on this map the location of Aleppo up here in northwestern corner of Syria, very close to two of the Turkish frontiers, were less than 100 kilometres on each side from Aleppo. So it's been much more difficult to isolate Aleppo from forces encouraged or funded from outside than is the case in other major population centres in Syria. The city is long exposed to developments in a region spreading across all of northern Syria to as far east as the Euphrates-Tigris river system, a region which has been massively disturbed by events since the war in Iraq in 2003. Now, the reason why I've put this second map here is because all these little dots represent locations of units of various armed forces which are involved in the conflict. And you can see how much more heavily concentrated these forces are around Aleppo compared to the more remote parts of the northern Syrian region. Now, the middle part of this lecture will provide a brief survey of some of the city's major monumental zones, and I divided it into 3 sections, which I'll indicate now. On this is my base map I use for all my researchers on Aleppo. But what we want to talk about today are three particular areas. Here you have the great Citadel of Aleppo, and just below it you have a very interesting zone which we'll discuss later on. The second area to concentrate on is this axis which spreads between what was originally the western walls of the city up to the Citadel, cutting right across the urban spread. And the third area is this area below that axis, which is particularly marked by a number of Islamic schools and mosques, particularly from the Ottoman period. But of course it's the Citadel which is the most definitive feature of Aleppo. The Citadel is actually a partly natural rock outcrop, but partly built up by man-made occupation debris over the centuries, and then rounded off by the Islamic fortification works in the early 13th century. If we go back in time and look at the same view as seen by travellers, you see it was equally prominent, of course, in the 17th century. And this is the view taken from Jebel Joshan, which was the must-have viewpoint of Aleppo for many centuries. But looking more closely at the Citadel itself now, I mentioned the axis which joins the Citadel to the river and the western gate of the city over here. But the Citadel marked an elevated partly natural elevated position or high place, as found at many Syrian sites. There are numerous references, for example, in the Old Testament, which saw the worship of gods on high places, usually weather or fertility deities, as formidable competition for the Old Testament Yahweh. The yellow line there just describes again the axis across the central part of the city, which we'll keep on coming back to. But this is the magnificent Citadel on the rise, which was a natural vantage point for the high place. And by the way, here, this beautiful landscaping, which was just being completed on my last visit to Aleppo in early 2011, was funded by the Aga Khan Trust, which has done a great deal of remarkable work in Syria, particularly in the 90s and the early 2000s. But I would just single out one building which has given us a remarkable new insight into Aleppo's role, particularly in the Bronze and Iron Ages, a phase when Aleppo, traditionally in Western research, was assumed to have been a relatively minor principality under external Hittite or Aramaean control. Now, I'll keep on using in these slides this little timeline here to give you some idea of where we stand in the long span of Aleppo's history. But you can see there we're in the period of before BC, before Christian era, and we'll, in the course of this lecture, we'll go right through the various phases, although fairly selectively. On top of the Citadel was found, so I go back here just to point out to you that, still getting used to these buttons. On top, I want to point out this building, which was found more or less in the middle of the Citadel rise only in the 1990s and was explored by a German expedition for the last 20 years up to 2011. This high place was in the form of a physical temple. You see the outline plan there, located more or less on the middle of the axis going across the Citadel rise. And the temple was dedicated to the storm or weather god Hadad, who was later assimilated in the classical period to the Roman god Jupiter. The same attribution, of course, was given to the great temple in Damascus. And it's As a result of these recent researches, a substantial temple building has been found to mark this major cult centre. I give you some idea of the sculptural decoration which has been found at the temple. It's very much in the style you find in Hittite and Neo-Hittite sites across Asia Minor or Turkey. But its discovery in Aleppo led to remarkable new conclusions about the history of northern Syria in the late 2nd millennium and early 1st millennium BC. But let's now move on. Sorry, I'll just show you here the actual excavation site a few years ago. You can see it's a very large building, and the outline plan is there, and this aerial picture gives you a picture of the location of the temple on this huge mound, which is the Citadel of Aleppo. Now, going back to our master plan, and we're looking now at the second group of buildings, those along the major axis here through the traditional monumental city. In addition to the great rise of the Citadel, there is in Aleppo another smaller rise here. This is actually the remains of the original settlement, which was located there on the left, near the banks of the Kuwait River. And an axis developed between this settlement and the great religious centre over here to the right. The axis followed a track which joined the settlement to its religious pilgrimage place. And these together gave the city a new importance, which are now revealed in the archives of the enormously wealthy trading centre at Ebla to the south. So it's clear from both these recent excavations that the Aleppo temple is clearly an important place of regional pilgrimage, not just of local significance. The axis was formalized when the Greeks replanned the city after it was taken post-Alexander's conquests in the late 4th century BC. They replanned the city around a grid plan which was oriented along the existing path. Under the Romans, this wide central path was given colonnades on each side, a practice reflected in most sizable cities of the Roman East. And here I give you an example from Palmyra in central Syria. But this, you see here a plan of such an axis in the classical period. Over the centuries, it becomes broken up into small separate laneways as a result of earthquake damage and the sort of opportunistic redevelopment of little shops and booths on the course of the city's development. So what you have here is the modern souk area of the central monumental area of Aleppo, which results from the breakup of this traditional classical pattern is broken up as you see there. But the important point to note about this souk area is that it's still following the axis and the footprint of the original classical plan. Now we pause halfway down the great axis to look at the central great mosque, which also lay at the heart of the classical city. To the west of this space, we can still see remains of the Byzantine cathedral, which comes up on the top right there, that occupied the garden area of a downtown Roman temple. After the 7th century Islamic conquest, the cathedral remained, but the garden housed the city's congregational mosque, which is what you see there in the lower photo. These buildings which you see here are largely from the 12th and 13th century because the original mosque was destroyed in earthquake earthquakes over the previous 300 or 400 years. But these two pavilions here are actually from the 10th century AD. But the pride of the mosque was its beautiful 40-metre-high minaret. This is a rare example of Seljuk work in Syria, rather different from the Iranian and Turkish Seljuk style, with its decoration more classical in inspiration. This must surely be one of the most significant minarets of the Islamic world. First, its craftsmanship is quite exceptional. Second, though, it shows how Syria's rich architectural traditions survive from one era to another. Each civilization didn't reject or destroy, but absorbed earlier influences, in this case borrowing from the vast range of Byzantine buildings surviving even now west of Aleppo. Many classical references can be seen here: the little niches, the colonnettes, the flowing profile bands which divide the spaces, and the small shell-top decoration. But it is also, of course, informed by a new purpose. Quranic inscription bands flow around the minaret at each level. Early European travellers particularly admired the great minaret for its fine detailing, superb use of balance across its 5-layered panels. Unfortunately, it was taken up as a position for rebel snipers in 2012, and by April 2013 it was toppled, apparently by regime tank or artillery fire. And here you see the disastrous effect of the collapse of the minaret. This photo seems to have been taken just at the moment that it was collapsing. You can see from the rising dust cloud, but this is after the dust had cleared. That shows you what's left of the minaret. Now we go to our third group of buildings, which is along the southern edge of that axis there. We'll start off at the eastern end of the axis in the area in front of, sorry, I'm not used to the layout of these buttons. We're looking at the area right in front of the entrance to the Citadel here. I'm going to start. So we're up now to the Ayyubid period, in other words, in more or less the period of the early, or the middle period of the Crusades in Syria. And we'll start with this building here, which is not an exceptional architectural gem, but it's an important indicator, I think, of the spirit of its age. It's the burial place of al-Zahir Ghazi, who was a son of the great Islamic ruler Saladin, and who was given by his father the Principality of Northern Syria. However, he did much to keep Aleppo out of the conflicts that arose after Saladin's death between the various other sons. Ghazi's fame began when he came to his father's aid in besieging the great Crusader stronghold to the west at Saon in 1188. And that is the great castle at Saon as you see it today. Saladin was besieging the coastal fortresses of the Crusades after his great victory in Palestine in 1187, and swept up the coast, taking whatever castles he could quickly seize. But his forces were not large enough or well supplied enough to wage a determined onslaught against the long walls of the castle. It was his son's intervention, which took the form of the bombardment of the northern walls, which softened it up for the final assault that saw the surrender. Looming over this space here was the great double gateway to the Aleppo Citadel. And the walls which you see here in the castle as rebuilt under al-Zahir Ghazi very much reflected reflected Ghazi's commitment to the anti-Crusader movement. Now, this prince, who had greatly contributed to the campaign against the Crusaders, was then buried in the small dome room to the left of this photo at the foot of the Aleppo Citadel. What you see there is the dome burial chamber. We're here below the Citadel. This is the mosque itself, and you see, looking into the mosque courtyard, the dome chamber at the end. In fact, this zone beneath the Citadel had become a new focus of the city's spiritual, architectural and political development. Before the Ayyubid rulers, Nur-ad-Din, the Zengid ruler, had built up Aleppo as a bastion of Islam against the Crusade. But it was Ghazi and his wife who enshrined much of this message in the building and town planning of the city. From this plaza in front of the burial mosque, the annual Hajj led south through the cemetery area before heading for Damascus and the Hijaz. So the whole zone became an embodiment of the beliefs of the righteous and faith-focused Islamic rulers of the 12th and 13th centuries. Power, the maintenance of order and justice, and faith all received their physical symbols in this zone. In particular, Ghazi's wife, Deifa Khatun, survived her son by several decades. She oversaw a smooth transition to her grandson, Al-Aziz Muhammad, whose equally successful reign lasted 2 decades. Deifa Khatun steered the affairs of the northern Ayyubid state during those turbulent years and endowed a number of its most important and enduring monuments in the beautifully simple Ayyubid architectural style. You see here some examples of the style adopted in the early 13th century, but under the Ayyubids, particularly through the influence of Deifa Khatun. You can still see some classical inspiration in the use of columns, etc., but the decoration is very restrained in most areas, even in this huge Iwan or outdoor room looking onto the courtyard. But look how the emphasis is given to the most important features of the building. For example, this mihrab or prayer niche, which faces towards Mecca, and the beautiful strapped stonework decoration. This is very much the style encouraged under Deifa Khatun. While we're in this area at the foot of the Citadel, I'll just point out one example of the next style of Islamic decoration, the Mamluk period. By now, the use of architectural decoration has become a good deal more flamboyant than the sober-sided Ayyubids had observed. But it still took further some of the earlier themes, such as the use of stone banding, the use of contrasting stone, which you see here, elaborate paving, and the use of numerous varieties of stone. This building, which I'm showing you now, is a bathhouse or hammam built in 1389 by the Mamluk governor, Yalboga el-Nasiri. It's one of the most splendid bathhouses you would find anywhere, and I'm pleased to say won an Aga Khan Award in the 1980s for its careful restoration after decades of misuse as a felt factory. But the interior was on a huge scale with cathedral-like spaces for each of the main stages of undressing, washing, and steam. Sadly, as we'll see here, it fell victim to the inferno of destruction which was about to overcome this area. And in the process, it lost 2 of its great domes. Just pausing at another Mamluk building of this period, this one illustrates how Islamic architecture was willing to emulate styles of the past, as well as contemporary ideas brought, for example, by the Seljuks from the east. the use of mukanas, which was a Persian device to carry the transition between square and round forms, and was particularly used to mark doorways or niches, as you see on the lower slide. Another example is the use of some of the Byzantine architectural devices, such as these windswept acanthus leaves, which are used to mark as capitals on the top of columns. And you see it's adopted under the Mamluks in their rather more fanciful repertoire of decorative shapes here in exactly the same way on these capitals of the colonnettes framing the window spaces on the facade of this Islamic school. But let's return to the great cross-city axis to look at another phase of the city's transformation. When the Ottoman Turks took the city in 1516, they marked their political supremacy with an urban renewal program reflecting Ottoman Turkish style in architecture. Aleppo, for the Ottomans, won favour as the point where the routes converged each year for the pilgrimage to Mecca. The successful conclusion of the Hajj was the hallmark of the legitimacy of the Ottoman Sultan Caliph. To mark Aleppo's remaking, 4 new prestige projects were provided to give a new perspective along the city's ancient axis. The circles here mark the massive new buildings. 3 of them were religious, they're the red circles, and 1 was commercial. But we'll just examine the 3 on the right. With modern structures cluttering the landscape, it's difficult to pick the impression that the early Ottoman rulers were trying to make. This 70-year-old photograph, taken from the plaza in front of the Citadel, looking west along the city's axis, gives a clearer perspective. The 3 mosques are distinctively Ottoman, and 2 are the work of the great Ottoman court architect Sinan, who was employed under Suleiman the Magnificent. Sinan, though, was not appointed to that role until 1539, so our first mosque, Al-Khosrafiyya, must date from his service as an engineer with the Ottoman army when it transited Aleppo in the course of its campaigns to take Baghdad in Iraq. So Sinan was in Aleppo between the 2 phases of the Iraq campaign in mid-1536, and this must be the origin of his first project. As an apprentice work, Sinan's design for Suleiman the Magnificent did not diverge from then standard Anatolian designs. But for Syria, it was a new style, a flatter dome, use of pencil minarets, a prayer hall uncluttered by internal piers and with external buttresses. The project carries the name of the Ottoman governor who completed the complex, involving a mosque, a charitable kitchen, a madrasa, and later a burial chamber for his wife. 10 years later, the second building was another prestige project, realising with imperial support and again designed by Sinan. This time, Sinan's style is more confident, using elements of local Mamluk tradition, such as the bold addition of mukanas decoration over the prayer hall doorway, stone banding again, and intricate jigsaw-like stones in the lintel over the door. A third project in this Ottoman remake of the city, the Customs Khan, is buried among the busy market area. As the cramped laneway made a prestige facade impossible, the architect brings the entrance into prominence by raising a huge open dome over one of the major passages of the souk or market. Once inside, the Khan follows the standard plan of a central courtyard surrounded by by a second story for storage and accommodation for merchants. For part of its life, The Khan housed the English and French trading communities, who used it for both commerce and accommodation. The engraving on the bottom right there shows a group of local dignitaries receiving the English traders in another of the Aleppo Khans. By this stage, in the 16th century, the European trading community provided much of the basis for Aleppo's fame. In fact, Aleppo gets 2 mentions in Shakespeare, not a bad record. But England was only one of a range of European states or city-states which funded trading houses or consulates, each employing 20 or more traders, as well as consuls, chaplains, as well as hosting a stream of travellers who now found the city a pleasant place to stay and even to learn Arabic. So that's been a very brief tour of some of the main areas of historic Aleppo, and we now have to turn to a much sadder picture. We saw in the introduction some reasons why Aleppo has been an extreme example of the use of total war within a city, perhaps one of the worst since Warsaw or Stalingrad. Aleppo's agony has lasted much longer and is being conducted by a large number of players. The numerous rebel groups include a number of outside players with agendas set by parties external to Syria. Even if you go back to Tamerlane's invasion of 1400, which must have held the previous record for brutal disregard for citizens' lives, there is no valid comparison. Tamerlane, after all, was an outsider. His massacres were over in a few days, and he was not slaughtering his own people. As his father had done in Hama in 1982, however, President Bashar al-Assad has chosen to make an example of Aleppo, and his opponents have chosen equally callously to bring their fight right to the centre of a major populated area, knowing what the consequences would be. For the first 15 months, in fact, Aleppo stayed out of the Syrian conflict. Its trading and manufacturing role persuaded most inhabitants that it had no interest in taking on the regime. Its minorities were hostile to the Islamist agendas of the rebels. By mid-2012, however, the war was brought to Aleppo by outsiders, anxious to raise the stakes. Many of these groups were helpfully allowed to pass across the Turkish frontier by a government in Ankara keen to topple Assad and little concerned at the consequences arising from a new source of instability in northern Syria. The fighting rapidly settled into a tight pattern whose frontiers have hardly budged over the last 4 years. By 2012, 2 siege or counter-siege operations were underway. The regime sought from the west to maintain its hold, extending as far as the Citadel, while to the east developed as a playground for various largely Islamist factions. Both operations so that just shows you what I was just referring to, the various the siege and counter-siege operations with at the centre the historic centre described by the red square there. Both operations posed huge risks for their non-combatant communities. The contest depicted on this map uncannily resembles the 2 intertwined serpents depicted on the main doorway of the Aleppo Citadel, a common totemic symbol in medieval Syria, each serpent struggling to get a lock on the other in a death contest. And again, you see there how the small area of the central historic city is caught right in the middle of this conflict. But let's move in closer to explain why the central monumental area has become so closely contested. The blue line here shows the area of regime control, mainly to the left and to the south, and top and centre, areas held by rebel groups. And this little tongue of regime-held land, which gives access to the Citadel, is still retained by government forces, penetrating right into the old city. So we'll just move into this area more closely. And this again is my map with some of these recent developments marked in on it. Here is your red line around the monumental central city. This is the finger of regime-held territory, which penetrates right into the monumental zone. Here you have, in the striped area, you have the area which has been most heatedly contested, and you'll see underneath the stripes you've got these heavily outlined structures are all buildings of major monumental significance. The red flashes there marked severe shell damage, and these little red splotches here, little blobs, mark tunnel bombs, which I'll come to discussing in a minute. So the rebels had taken up positions in these downtown mosques right from the beginning of the contest. But a year later, rebel groups in this area, rebel groups coming in from the outside, began using tunnels to bring massive explosive power to the heart of the monumental area. Sorry, not all these transitions work as they should. But the worst clashes were then concentrated along this line between the regime's positions here and the rebel positions here. So this area was particularly affected by the nature of the confrontation. Now, of course, I feel somewhat uncomfortable highlighting the damage to monuments when a good more needs to be said about the rest of the city, particularly its housing stock in the east, which has been destroyed. A much larger area of destruction than we find in the comparatively small monumental centre. The areas of civilian housing have been pounded throughout much of the last 4 years. The monumental area suffered badly in 2012 to 14, but this tapered off to some extent with the stabilisation of battle lines in the ancient city. Now we'll look further at these statistics later, just as we close. But first I want to close in on the outcome of this contest in the area south and west of the Citadel. This area became the ground zero of the conflict in the years 2012 to 2015. What we have here is satellite imagery taken of the central area 18 months after the conflict began. And the casualties, as we'll see now, were mainly in this area and in this zone underneath the Citadel, both of which we've seen in our earlier survey of the architecture of the city. And of course, the Citadel continued to do what citadels are supposed to do, become a fortified position for the rulers, and remains so to this day. So somehow or other, the regime was able to hold on to the Citadel and to get access to it across these lines here. Now we're moving closer, and this shows you Google Earth picture of the Great Mosque 2 years into the conflict in Aleppo. By now we have some significant areas of damage. You have here the toppled minaret, which we saw earlier. You have here 2 very large areas of shelling on the eastern side of the courtyard of the Great Mosque, and you don't see it because it's mainly hidden under the roofs of the souk or market area here. Considerable burnt out damage in the central market area. Going back to that, the earlier pictures of the This was the early picture you saw of the courtyard of the mosque. This is the picture as you see it today. And this is that eastern portico of the mosque, which was burnt out by that shelling, as a result of the shelling which took place on the eastern edge of the mosque. In a second phase of confrontation, the area particularly targeted was that monumental zone under the Citadel. As we've seen, this zone embodied the righteous and faith-focused rulers of the 12th and 13th centuries who had held back the Crusaders. Power, the maintenance of order and justice, and piety all received their physical symbols in this zone. And this early 2011 view shows the great ceremonial Ayyubid Plaza, which was superbly restored by the Aga Khan Foundation. Unfortunately, the front line would later run right through this zone, continuing into the market area to the right. All these buildings were gone by September 2014. The lower photo, sorry, these are not corresponding very well. So this shows you some of the results of the destruction caused by the tunnel bombs in this area. There were about 5 of them, and it particularly toppled the mosque of Al-Zahir Ghazi. It toppled this first project of Sinan in Aleppo, the Khosrafiya Mosque, and it even toppled this massive government headquarters building in Aleppo, which was built under the French in the 1930s in a sort of a neo-Saracenic style. So here you see the results of one of these tunnel bombs. You can see how massive the explosions are. All that's left after the explosives have been set off is a huge crater which sucks the whole remains of the structure into the cavity, often just leaving piles of rubble and powdered stone. This is that area again at the foot of the Citadel there, before, and this is the after story. This is another building, the Carlton Hotel, which was a late Ottoman hospital developed in the 1890s, and that had been used as a barracks by the Syrian army and was completely destroyed in a couple of tunnel bombs in 2014. So just a reminder, this is the area we're talking about, the gateway to the Citadel, and these red splodges are the massive tunnel bombs which affected this area. So Al-Zahir Ghazi and Daifa Khatun's righteous, restrained expression of faith have been rejected in favour of these ruins. I wonder whether the Islamists and their rich backers paused to think. The son of Saladin was buried there, one of the most successful Ayyubid rulers and the great leader of jihad against the Crusaders. And before you assume that ISIS was responsible for this sacrilege, remember that this is 10 months before ISIS, who never managed to reach central Aleppo, came on the Syrian scene. This is the work of a Salafist group united under the Saudi-backed Islamic Front in late 2013. They were even so proud of their handiwork that they proclaimed it on their website, and they have never yet received the opprobrium that ISIS has invited for their appalling destruction in the next year. But buildings of solid limestone have been turned simply into dust clouds or powdered rubble by massive underground explosions. And you can see the full extent. Oh, sorry, I just drew your attention to that then. Sorry. In order to leave a bit of time for questioning, I might just skip a couple of slides. These are some of the beautiful houses in the Jadede quarter, just outside the walls of Aleppo, but even that area has been badly affected. Now, I just want to finish up with a few facts and figures. What I've sought today is to give you a dispassionate picture, one that avoids arguments based on one side's arguments. I have not glossed over inconvenient facts that the media has chosen not to address, nor do I want to spread claims that have not been checked or exaggerated. The last thing Syria needs is for people to walk away from the country assuming everything is lost. I've been following the pattern of destruction now for 5 years, using images or material posted on websites from numerous sources. The results of this continuing survey are updated on my website each month. And the conclusions I draw, particularly in relation to Aleppo, on the severity of the damage are as follows. In the first two categories of destruction, the most serious categories, there are 43 severe cases of total destruction nationally in Syria and 47 of major damage. Of these, between them, Aleppo, and I've also thrown in here Palmyra, have suffered disproportionately. They've had 51 out of 90, or 57%, of the cases in the first two categories of destruction. In major damage, Palmyra leads with 15 cases, but it's low on categories 2 to 5, so its destruction has been concentrated very much in the worst cases. Aleppo has a higher incidence of destruction, with 34 cases in the first two categories. But it has more cases, in fact 47, of buildings damaged but not irreparably. The damage to Aleppo has been done by all sides of the conflict. It will leave scars across the city and will take generations to restore. So I'll leave you with a few afterthoughts on the results of the crisis. And I hope that this account has not been so dispassionate that you think I'm downplaying what has been lost. So let me give a little bit of context. We shouldn't feel sorry for pretty lifeless stones or assume we can quarantine them from the present breakdown of authority. We should always see the damage in context of what is happening to the whole society. Above all, there can be no restoration of monuments without harnessing the talents, inspiration, and deep feeling for their culture of the Syrian people. Commentators abroad perhaps like to assume that only foreigners appreciate these remains. Nothing could be further from the truth. In his opening address to this meeting last month, Mamoun Abdul Karim gave a remarkable address which rose above all the hostilities of the current conflict to report on how local citizens and the locally based staff of his Directorate General have collaborated across conflict lines to limit the damage to sites or buildings. That story necessarily is still to be told, but it underlines that Syrians have acquired an appreciation of the ruins in their midst, not only as an economic asset to attract tourists, but as markers of the complexity of their societies, to the continuity, diversity, and ultimately, hopefully, the resilience of these cultures. One significant asset Syria enjoys, and one that was not exploited in the tragedies which earlier overwhelmed Lebanon or Iraq, is that over 30 years or in the 30 years or so that I've been visiting Syrian sites, I have seen how the citizens of Syria in the broad have come to appreciate their heritage. Once, in the 80s particularly, you could visit sites that attracted no local visitors on any scale. By 2010, you could visit places that were simply overwhelmed at times by local school parties, visiting families, engineers on incentive travel, or local picnickers. The Syrian education system has put great emphasis since the 1980s on using the monuments to underline the layers of culture, the diversity offered by Syria's past. And you may be puzzled as to why I've shown this photo here, but it is an example of a building that was almost totally destroyed in 1982, but has been superbly restored by the local Director of Antiquities in Hama after the events of 1982. And you would find it very difficult to spot any imperfections in the way in which his work and the use of his very skilled stonemasons have been able to apply to restoring the project authentically. I just want to finish by quoting the words of one of the great foreign explorers of Syria's antiquities, Michael Gawlikowski, a Polish archaeologist who's been active, particularly in Palmyra, since the 1970s. He had this to say: "The restoration of ancient buildings must come later, when the war is over. Even then, the priority will be to save the people, not the monuments. That's why discussion around restoring Palmyra is futile. Nothing should be done before the city's inhabitants are able to return. The architecture and the monuments can wait. They're already broken. Nothing will happen to them." So the first and last plea I would make is, don't write off Syria as a lesson in world cultures that failed in the face of barbarism. Much of the worst damage can be restored, but doing so must be part of a regeneration program for Syrian society, not a diversion for publicity seekers putting up mock garden arches in the City Hall Park in New York, for example, or Trafalgar Square in London. I started writing my history of Aleppo a decade ago, but it has received a new urgency now to mark the milestones in the city's long history. And if you're interested, there are some handouts outside about the book. I'm embarrassed about its ridiculous price, but it will be available as a paperback next year, hopefully, and is already a Kindle on the Amazon website. But I would emphasise that I'm not doing any of this to make money, since all my earnings from the book will be ploughed into UNICEF and MSF, who I think are my most commended charities addressing some of the human consequences of the Syrian conflict. But thank you again for this opportunity to be at this wonderful venue.
That was a very impressive lecture, Dr. Burns. I have to say that when you look at the destruction that has taken place in Aleppo, it's very heart-wrenching to see, the centuries, the millennia of architectural history suddenly disappearing through the catastrophes of war. And all I can say is that we very much appreciate the work that you've done, Ross, in terms of recording, in terms of writing the history of Aleppo, because I think that when it comes to reconstruction, whenever it may happen sometime in the future, it's going to be a very important part to restore parts of the built environment. Because when it comes to restoring the identity of the people of Aleppo, yes, there are priorities which will be about human housing. It's going to be about the utilities, the hospitals, the schools. But I think that there's also part of the soul of the city that has to be redeveloped and reconstructed, which is the memory of the past. And I think that when you have cultures with so much history, so much memories of the past, this is a vital part of what the future lies in store. So thank you again, Ross Burns. I think that your lecture has been very revealing. It's been very poignant, but I think it also shows you the importance culture does have in people's identity, but also our appreciation of the past of this remarkable city. So again, thank you very much, Ross.